not even a concept in the West. I would say people in Christianity, like in the Christian framework, don't think that you can have this profound experience of divinity in the same level that Jesus was talking about, you know.
Mhm.
Whereas in other traditions, like in the East, with Buddhism and Hinduism, and with Western esotericism like Hermeticism and Neoplatonism, the explicit point of those traditions that people are saying in those works is that you should go and experience this just like I have. That's
Right.
what we're doing here, and that's what's valuable. All right, so welcome back to the pod, everyone. Welcome back to the pod. So today we're going to be talking about some things. We're going to be talking about rejected knowledge today. Some rejected knowledge, getting into the classic rejected knowledge, some ancient wisdom narrative type stuff. A concept that we have explored a lot, partly because we did a master's degree in basically in this subject in Western esotericism at the University of Amsterdam. And so that's where we both learned about it, I think. Like for me, I really didn't know about this at all. I had never even heard the word Western esotericism until I applied for the degree.
Mhm.
Um, but I figured it was a good idea because I thought I'd studied so much Eastern spirituality and philosophy, and I should learn a bit about Western philosophy and spirituality.
Mhm.
And it turned out to be amazing. You know, I'd done philosophy as well before, so like Plato and stuff wasn't new to me. And I'd heard a little bit about Hermeticism, mainly from the Kybalion, which is a book of Hermeticism that the scholars don't like because it's like a pseudo book. But yeah, so that's when I discovered. I don't know. You heard about Western esotericism before you did the degree as well?
No, I had not. Which now it's almost hard to imagine, right? I was 23 at the time, and I'd already done my bachelor, so I'd already been in the university, doing social science and humanities, minoring in philosophy, majoring in anthropology. So you would sort of, and I always had an interest in wisdom traditions, like that was the reason why I got into these fields. So it's hard to imagine that I'd never heard of Western esotericism, and I'd never, encountered anything substantial about this particular strand of the history of ideas. And now it's like I can't imagine a world where this is not on my radar.
Right. Yeah, that was one of the most amazing things for me to discover, that there is such a thing as a whole 2,000 years worth of intellectual history of the West, just even without the Western esotericism aspect. Like
Mm.
it turns out that Western esotericism is a major element of the Western intellectual tradition. But I didn't even know that, like, there was such a thing as this 2,000-year progression of thought, like basically starting at Plato and the pre-Socratic philosophers, going all the way until now. And some people, like like Wouter Hanegraaff, our lecturer, some people have like a pretty solid idea of that whole intellectual history, which is pretty impressive. And so you can just there's a whole narrative, and then we're a part of it. Like you often say, like we're in history. We're in history, and we've actually been led to this moment by like thousands of years of thought, and it's almost like it's one person thinking that, like one collective mind, one
Mhm.
massive conversation, a dialogue that's led to this moment. And that's just in the West. That's just in the Western culture. So yeah, so I think a bit of the context for this episode is the fact that we're in a meaning crisis. Generally, why this is important is because we're in a meaning crisis right now, crisis of meaning. It turns out that the current worldview that we live in at the moment of kind of scientism and materialism um, is kind of unsatisfying for a lot of people. It's soulless, it lacks meaning, and it's now seemingly untrue. It's not really, it doesn't really hold up to the new philosophical critiques and scientific discoveries. So we've got this crisis of meaning. We're also in the post-religious world, where we were living in this religious world for a long time. Now we've thrown out religion. Now we're in the scientific world. Now the scientific worldview is not really satisfying anymore. And so there's kind of a problem with which is going on. But so what we've discovered now is that there's a whole hidden history of Western spirituality. And I should also say that a lot of people turn to Eastern religions, Eastern spirituality. You know, when they have this meaning crisis, a lack of religion, they turn towards Buddhism and yoga and stuff like that, and also New Age ideas. But I think people don't realize now this kind of idea is so new that people don't realize that there's this whole history of Western spirituality, Western esotericism, in other words. And there's this wealth of knowledge that is actually at the roots, and literally at the roots of Western civilization. And it's really like a treasure trove of a cultural heritage, wisdom, spirituality, philosophy, art, and culture that's really been hidden from society because of specific events that happen in history, and basically because of human bias and institutional power, which we're going to get into later. How these ideas were systematically excluded from our shared history and kind of pushed aside and demonized. And so our memory of the past has been erased. But basically, there's this whole tradition and this whole thread of wisdom traditions, philosophical traditions, and intellectual history that's been rejected and excluded from what we know. And so it also turns out that they're pretty interesting, and there's a lot of good stuff in these traditions. And it might kind of, allow us to, it might inform us on how we deal with the meaning crisis, or how we deal with this changing landscape of our worldview being on shaky ground, as well as the chaos of ideas, the epistemic chaos of social media and stuff like that. There is this grounding and this cultural heritage to the West, this Western spirituality, which is not only Christianity and not only the church or Islam and Judaism. There's a whole nother thing which has its roots in our civilization. So yeah, that's kind of the context, I would say. So basically, there has been a conspiracy of human bias, powerful institutions to control the narrative of our human story and impose specific dogmas on us. And that is what has happened, is that our memory of the past has been erased. And so we have a couple of questions about this that will kind of guide the episode. Which the one is, how did this knowledge get forgotten and erased? How did this happen? And then what did the ancient Greek and Egyptian and Roman philosophers and spiritual traditions have in common? And why were they so obsessed with these ideas? Why was ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, and ancient Rome so obsessed with these esoteric ideas, with these spiritual philosophical ideas? And also, what were these ideas specifically? What do they mean for us today? And how might they solve the meaning crisis and help us answer the big questions today of science and philosophy? How we were saying earlier, we studied at the University of Amsterdam, and we studied under Wouter Hanegraaff, who's actually someone who basically, him and a couple other people, including Antoine Ferver, basically founded this field, the modern academic study of Western esotericism. And it was only really in the 90s that they started doing this as an academic study. And so, yeah, so it's a pretty new thing, and it's basically the see why we think this is significant is because people don't really know yet in our modern society about this history, about this rejected knowledge. So the term rejected knowledge was also coined by Wouter Hanegraaff, and so it's kind of like a piece of new information that we're recovering this element of our history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's what Wouter Hanegraaff talks about, as a sort of it's like a waste basket that a lot of these ideas have ended up in, right? Because in certain time periods, for different reasons, there have been certain strand of ideas that have systematically been rejected. And as you alluded to before, it's basically for political reasons, sort of from institutional power or from a certain bias. A lot of these ideas have just been discarded into this wastebasket, and the wastebasket is still sitting there. It's still part of the intellectual history, the history of ideas, and only now is that getting serious scholarly attention. But I think the argument that we would make is that there's also cultural relevance, or you might say spiritual relevance, to re-engaging with some of these ideas, right? Because if you live in a world where, like, if you're part of Western culture, but more generally, if you're part of human culture, I would even say, and you find yourself in a crisis of meaning, as we do today, where certain established worldviews that we're all familiar with are no longer satisfying when it comes to answering our existential questions, like, these traditional dogmatic religious beliefs, or sort of dry rationalistic scientific worldview. And then when time comes to sort of reconsider then, or reconstruct your own worldview, or to re-engage with a deeper existential meaning, then suddenly it becomes extremely relevant to know about this wastebasket of ideas that in different time periods, you know, these ideas have been rejected for reasons that don't make them necessarily incredulous, and so
Mm-hmm.
it's time for a reappraisal of some of these ideas, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. And are they incredulous? I mean, that is kind of the key point. I mean, we wouldn't be talking about them if they weren't credulous, because you
Mm-hmm.
know this is one of the things, is that there seems to be a commonality to the core ideas in these ancient wisdom traditions that you find in ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, and Rome, where this was going on. And then it continued after that from then on. But you find these common ideas. You find these common ideas, and you also find similar ideas in the East, which completely align. So the Eastern spiritual traditions completely align with the Western traditions. Now we can
Mm-hmm.
get into that as well. This was a debate about that and how they're also different, but there is a fundamental core that's quite quite similar, very 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 similar, and it also aligns with like new insights about science, like quantum field theory, new information about consciousness, and studies in like psi neurology, like about telepathy and stuff like that. That kind of breaks open the materialistic paradigm and opens it into a worldview that actually finds that's actually been articulated and is very compatible with the ancient wisdom of the West
Mm.
and the East. So that's quite a story.
So what are we actually talking about? What are we actually talking about here when we talk about esotericism? Because I find that when I mention to people that I did a master's in religious studies with a focus on Western esotericism, they often stare at me sort of, blank-eyed, and like have no idea what I'm talking about. And then I have to mention a couple of concepts or different traditions from history to kind of illustrate, like, this is what we call esotericism. It's also what Wouter Hanegraaff says, that it's kind of difficult to define esotericism. And in fact, for Wouter Hanegraaff, the very defining characteristic of what we label as esoteric is the fact that it has been rejected from the mainstream, right? And that's why he
Mm-hmm.
says that basically esotericism is rejected knowledge. That's what they all have in common. They're basically sort of heterodox ideas that have been rejected from the orthodox centers of authority,
Mm-hmm.
whether that be religious or later on, sort of rationalistic, scientific in nature.
Yeah,
But could you
yeah,
sketch a little bit of the history to, just so people understand what we're talking about?
for sure. I think also just on that point about the definition of rejected knowledge, that's also a very, very, very academic definition where Vouts is
Mm.
playing 4D chess with other academics. And so he chooses to define it in that way, where you can actually also just define it in a more direct way to define what it actually is,
Mhm.
which you get in Antoine Favre's definition a little bit more. But yeah, so what are we talking about here? I mean, I have a list of the kind of traditions that would fall under Western esotericism. So these people will be familiar with, and so well, not everyone, but you have Hermeticism, which is the ancient Egyptian spirituality. You have Greek philosophy, Plato, pre-Socratic philosophers, general Platonic philosophy. They have Neoplatonism. Then you have Gnosticism, Kabbalah, alchemy, astrology, and then Renaissance magic, occult philosophy, Theosophy, Rosicrucianism, Freemasonry, and Anthroposophy. Now, the latter list of those names is kind of the continuation of these ideas from the original origins. And so that's one of the interesting things, is that there's kind of this golden thread that continues from the origins of Western civilization through to the current day. And then it even leads into the New Age. So a lot of people today don't know that the New Age spirituality is kind of a lot of it draws on ancient Western esotericism, and a lot of it's a bastardization, corruption of it, or adding new things onto it. But there's a lot of roots in that with the original core of Western esotericism. So I'd say the core things that are the most interesting to me as well are the Hermeticism, the Greek philosophy, and the Neoplatonism. And so the Hermeticism is basically the ancient Egyptian spirituality, ancient Egyptian religion, based on the Hermes Trismegistus, the sage, the philosopher sage of Egypt, of ancient Egypt. Now, these texts emerged in around the 1st century AD, but they kind of call back to a tradition that goes thousands of years back, according to the texts themselves. And they kind of go back to the founding of the pyramids. That's what the texts claim. But as far as we know, they're from about 2,000 years ago. And then with the Plato, you have Plato, which was about 500 years BC. So he's 500 years before Christ. And there was a massive flourishing of ideas then with Plato and Greek philosophy. Then also you have, after that, Neoplatonism, which comes in around the 2nd century AD, and that's in Rome. So one thing I also didn't realize for a while was that Neoplatonism was actually practiced in Rome by people mainly with philosophers like Plotinus and Porphyry and a couple others I can't think right now, but Plotinus is really the main one. And so they were just kind of going with the Platonic tradition and fleshing it out and reinterpreting it in a more spiritual way. And so these are basically these were the trendy intellectual ideas and the core of a spiritual tradition in ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, and ancient Rome. Mm-hmm. And so this is what was going on. Now, yeah, so there's this thread of ideas that continue through history, and they also continue, after the original and late antiquity flourishing of these ideas. They continue on mainly through Islamic esotericism. They were picked up later on, translating of texts and that kind of stuff. And then in the Renaissance, there was, of course, the massive translation. There was a massive flourishing of esoteric ideas, where the Medici family paid for translations of Platonic and Hermetic texts. And so then in the 1600s, there was another flourishing of ideas, which was kind of just before the scientific enlightenment happened. And then then the lid was really put on this completely again. And so that's what we're talking about. We're going to get into what the ideas actually are in a little bit. But I'll just mention the 2 points in history when these ideas were systematically excluded. So Walter Hanegraaff wrote a book called what is it called? Esotericism in the Academy, Rejected Knowledge, something. Yeah. Rejected Knowledge. His main book about this, and this is ginormous academic work about exactly how, piece by piece, like a forensic analysis of history, the history of ideas of how all of Western esotericism was excluded from our history. First by Christianity, basically, by the church, by the Catholic Church, who deemed everything that wasn't Christianity as paganism, as like heretical and satanic and evil and not a good thing. And that's still why you get some Christians today who like think of witchcraft. Anything that's like astrology, like your friend's doing astrology and they're like, she's a witch or something, because people are still got this programming that anything that's not Christian is like evil and pagan. And so that was a big exclusion that happened, and it made it illegal to be practicing these things, basically. And then later on, fast forward to about the 1600s and then the 1800s, when the scientific enlightenment happened, then there was a giant excluding of things from the history books, systematically excluding the intellectual history of Western esotericism from our history books that people were writing at this time, because they had a bias against this kind of stuff, and they thought it was superstitious and nonsense. So they threw the baby out with the bathwater. And then there was this new bias and this new dogma which was established, which was that science and rationalism are the only things that matter. and we don't want to be associated with the spiritual past of ourselves. Like we want to be like we're all, Plato was just this cool rational dude, and it was like the Socratic dialogue and stuff, and it, it's kind of like this embarrassing history. And it's the same with all these scientists that have been whitewashed from their spiritual nature. Their spiritual nature has been whitewashed out of them because there's this bias now today. But yeah, I think it's starting to break down, and now there's a new interest in Western esotericism.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
That's kind of the general overview, right? That there's the original flourishing of ideas around, in sort of late antiquity, sort of in antiquity, of course, with Plato. Already, of course, also taking inspiration from older traditions, from the Chaldeans, from the Egyptians, perhaps from the Brahmins in the East, and then coming up with the worldview that was deeply spiritual. Also, something that people don't often know about Plato. It's also called sort of the esoteric Plato, right? It's a different type of reading of Plato that actually reveals a deeply spiritual worldview. And then the revival of those ideas in late antiquity, right, with Neoplatonism in Rome, but also in Hellenic Egypt, so in Greek-speaking Egypt, which was a colony
right.
of the Greek culture.
Yeah.
With things like Gnosticism, like an early Christian movement that was very much focused on the spiritual liberation of the individual through divine insight or self-realization, or the realization of divine insight through a certain initiatory process, right? Ritualistic initiatory process. And then, of course, the Hermetic texts that we still know today are also from the same time period, from late antiquity. So we're talking like from 200 to 400 AD, and then basically all of that already gets suppressed by the church, right? Already the church starts to become more institutionalized, becomes a state religion, and then the church or religion becomes also a tool for power, right? And becomes a means for the state to also enforce a certain hierarchy onto the populace. And then so these spiritual ideas that are more focused on personal liberation, that are more focused on the individual and their relationship to the divine, a direct, unmediated relationship to the divine, becomes basically a threat to that type of political power. And so what follows is suppression, and the things like the Gnostic Gospels and the Hermetic texts basically either get destroyed, or the followers of these sects have to do that, have to sort of practice underground, and monasteries get demolished, and the people get persecuted for following these spiritual traditions, right? So there's already a bias against this type of teaching or school of thought. What follows is basically sort of also a dark age, right, of this type of more sophisticated philosophy and engagement with these spiritual philosophical ideas, in broad strokes, right? So of course, there's a little essentializing here, but just to paint a broad stroke picture.
Mm-hmm.
And then, like you said, it's in the Muslim world that a lot of these ideas actually survive. But the Muslims also, in the Middle Ages, they take more Aristotle's ideas than Plato's ideas, but still they have their own
Mm-hmm.
version of Aristotle, and there's also Islamic mysticism or spiritual traditions, and Islamic
Mm-hmm.
occultism that
Mm-hmm.
flourishes. And this is also a time period when alchemy first emerges, also in the context
Right.
of Northern
Forgot about
Africa,
alchemy.
right? And then that basically also starts to trickle back into Europe in the Middle Ages, where there's like a resurging interest in alchemy and in certain sort of occult magical practices like talismanry and that type of stuff. And then basically there's again that comes up, and then in the Renaissance that really comes to full fruition again, and then there's a resurgence of the interest in the antique ideas, and with that also is a revival of the interest in spiritual ideas or in ideas of the occult. which basically means what's hidden from the eye, right? The hidden dimensions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But then, of course, yeah, like you also already said, again, the church basically starts to crack down on that, basically because it feels threatened in its religious authority, because uh, the truth is that a lot of these practices empower the individual to take matters into their own hand when it comes to their spiritual evolution, right? Or when it comes to spiritual practices.
Mm-hmm.
And the church feels threatened by that, starts to crack down on it, and basically starts to demonize uh, what is considered as pagan or non-Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And that basically follows its course until the scientific enlightenment, when then these ideas are basically no longer demonized, but they're ridiculized as superstitious, right? And then
Mm-hmm.
that means that, throughout history, these types of ideas, spiritual ideas, occult ideas, have been relegated to the wastebasket. Um, and because this has been the climate in Europe, basically pretty hostile, antagonistic climate towards these ideas from institutional powers, means that also the way that these ideas have been expressed throughout European history has been in basically like initiatory cults. So in secret societies or initiatory cults, where it's basically a controlled environment where only the true seeker would be allowed, and the true seeker would then be initiated into a sect or a society, where they would be guided to higher forms of knowledge, right? Knowledge of the spiritual worlds, or higher forms of self-realization. Uh, and I think the reason that this has been the configuration of a lot of this thought of these ideas in this type of social dynamic or cultural form is also because of the environment that has been relatively hostile against these ideas. If
Mm-hmm.
there hadn't been a bias against certain ideas, then there wouldn't have been as much of a need for secrecy. And I think also part of the reason why it's called esoteric, esoteric basically means secret, as opposed to public. So exoteric is public teaching. Esoteric is basically secret.
Or external and internal as well.
Right. Yeah, there's different ways of defining it, of course. But I think
Yeah,
for me, this is a way that I make sense of it, right? If the environment is relatively hostile to these ideas, then of course there also comes a need for secrecy
for
around these
sure.
ideas,
Mm-hmm.
and you definitely see this in the way, the type of language that is used by medieval alchemists to sort of talk about spiritual ideas or spiritual practices has to be codified, basically, because otherwise you risk being burnt at the stake. It's one thing to try and look for gold, but it's another thing to seek to realize the God or the divine in yourself, and um, yeah, and hence the sort of cryptic use of cryptic language and secret societies and this whole history, which
Right.
gives it an allure, makes it interesting. It's kind of like when you discover this history, it's like discovering a secret library. But it also makes it a little bit elusive and difficult to study, and still in academic debate, there's no consensus about the true meaning of certain teachings, because academics have a hard time figuring out what are they actually talking about,
Mm-hmm.
right? And academics are a bit wary of giving too much credence to some of the ideas, um, which leads to sometimes certain explanations that maybe for a spiritual seeker don't seem to align with their intuition about what some of these
Yeah.
ancient writers talk about.
Well, yeah. There's the academic kind of game of, or the academic meta of being overly cautious, overly um, analytical, and uh, kind of cautious, so that you don't actually say anything. You have all these opinions. You don't make any bold statements. You kind of just defending your view, and you analyze everything and break it down into little pieces. And if you assert something, then it's a big deal. And there's also a bias against being seen as religious or spiritual. So in the academics, it's a very sober minded kind of like I'm not in, I'm just a neutral observer. I'm just objective. Spirituality, the spiritual ideas here, we're just studying them objectively, like we're just kind of third party witnesses. Meanwhile, these people never like reveal why they have such a lifelong passion in like Hermes Trismegistus or alchemy. They act like they just happen to be there, like scientists just assigned by the state to just go through the files and talk about it. So they kind of put their passion on the backbone or to the side. But it's also very valuable to do that, because then you get the kind of the rigor that you get, and these books, and it kind of offers a different value to it than the more spiritual, esoteric things. And I think a good middle ground for me is to, if I'm thinking about spiritual ideas or the history of ideas, to be like have one foot in the skeptical academic mind, and then one foot in the spiritual mind. So that's kind of in the middle. But yeah, I think maybe we should talk about a little bit about also some of the key ideas about, you mentioned that there's a more individual relationship with the divine in Western esotericism, which is a thing that the church doesn't like. But I think another thing is one of the key ideas that you find, which you also find in the East, and you now find it, some would argue, in quantum physics, which is the idea of oneness, the idea of non-duality, or the monad, which this is really the core thing. I mean, what does it come down to? Like, Hermeticism in Plato and in Neoplatonism, you have this idea of nature. One of the main things, that nature is alive and that nature is conscious. Nature is a living being. Well, the universe is alive. So it's almost the antithesis of materialism, of our current worldview in a way, because instead of nature being dead matter, nature is alive. The universe is alive and conscious. And there's a oneness, there's a fundamental unity that you have with the whole universe. So the universe is one whole thing, one absolute whole. It's one absolute kind of conscious mind, in a way, living spirit or something like that, that manifests itself in the world. And so you have it in Plato. You have the realm of forms, and he kind of views the physical world as an illusion, the physical world as a shadow or imitation of the true world, and the true world is where the absolute good and the true and the beautiful reside. And this world's kind of an illusion, and we need to get ourselves to purify our soul, basically, and return to the divine origin and remember our true nature. So that's the Platonic idea. And then you have a couple more things about that with Plato, but in Neoplatonism, then you have he takes it even further. This is a very, very non-dual tradition, Neoplatonism, what was going on in Rome at the time. And he has the idea of the one, or the monad. Plotinus talks about a monad, right? Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I think so.
And so it's absolute unity, beyond being, beyond thought, beyond all description. Everything existent emanates from the one. So here you have emanationism, where there's this absolute oneness, this kind of primordial being, this transcendent, pure energy, which sounds very similar to the idea of a quantum field. Pure energy that's then manifesting itself as the world, that we're perceiving these atoms and molecules as these specific colors and shapes and forms that our biological brain is perceiving. But these things emanate out of a kind of an absolute oneness. And so this places the human on the same level as the divine. So you are literally part of the divine. So you have this fundamental unity and relationship with the divine that's available to you. And it also introduces another element to life, which is that you're in a relationship to the divine, and that you can become more and more aligned with it and experience it more, and experience this beauty, this goodness, this truth more and more. And it's a totally different picture than materialism, the current world we live in, and it's a totally different picture from dogmatic Christianity as well, you know. And so it kind of stands as like there's a three-parted leg of the Western intellectual tradition, maybe. The non-dual Western esotericism, and then the Christianity, and then the intellectual or the scientific materialism. They're all very different. Yeah. And of course, in Hermeticism, you have the idea of as above, so below. and the cosmos being a mirror, being cosmos and the human being a mirror. And you have the idea of the divine mind, the nous, which the universe is a living, thinking being permeated with consciousness. And so the human being is fundamentally divine, and the universe is a giant conscious mind. And so basically, they're all remarkably similar. And the crazy thing as well is that they're remarkably similar to what you find in the ancient Eastern traditions, in Vedanta and in Buddhism. This is the crazy thing is that the West has its own deep spiritual tradition. It's actually and it's actually at the core of the Western civilization and the ideas that found Western civilization. So, but we don't know about this.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was going
Yeah,
to say.
and basically, we have been robbed of access to those ideas by a corrupt political religious institution, namely the church, because the church has never wanted the common people to have access to profound spiritual ideas that actually, if known, cannot be controlled. And so the church has always wanted to be the gatekeeper for access to spiritual knowledge, and therefore has always engaged in aggressive repression throughout history since the inception of the church, basically. And then since the church has kind of lost its central authority in determining the worldview that people live under, and we've been sort of liberated by science, so to speak, from dogmatic belief, the scientifically minded man, sort of the scientifically minded person, has not yet had the wherewithal or the awareness to actually go back to some of these original ideas that have been repressed and see what it is there that we have discarded or that the church has repressed. And I think that's long overdue. It's long overdue that we as a culture now also like look back to some of those ideas now that we are no longer under the under the dominion of a religious authority telling us what to believe and what not to believe. I think there's a lot to be gained from taking some of these ancient ideas seriously and considering them on their own terms instead of through the lens of a biased position that already discards them as superstitious, and see what it is that they might reveal. And I think it's it's in a concept like gnosis, that you can really see the type of alternative worldview that you're addressing, that you're talking about, right? Because if you talk about the nous, the Greek word for it's difficult to translate the word, but commonly translated as mind or intellect. But it's like the divine mind or the cosmic intellect. Then the term gnosis means to attain to a knowledge of that state where you're in direct relationship to that, divine cosmic mind. And what that means, it's basically a type of knowledge that is direct, unmediated knowledge of the divine state of being. So it's what John Vervaeke would call participatory knowledge, right? It's participatory knowledge where actually the boundary between the subject, the knower, and the object, the known, dissolves. And it's through that phenomenon of gnosis occurring that the non-dual nature of reality actually becomes experiential, right? And that the spiritual seeker, actually reaches a state where there's no longer a division between themselves and the God that they're trying to ascend to. So if you have the one and all the levels of emanations trickle down from that, but fundamentally are still part of the same original unity, and it's from our place here in the world of the many, right, in the manifold world of manifestation, that we can engage in a ritual process through which we can ascend back up the ladder of emanations and attain to a state of oneness with the original monad, which is the true source of reality, which is the sort of the ground of being, right? And so I think that's crucial to my understanding about what we're talking about here. It's the worldview or the ontology that is fundamentally non-dual, but it's also about the process
Mm-hmm.
and the participatory knowledge of that state. So it's not just an intellectual concept, right? And this is also, of course, what Wouter Hanegraaff talks about in the Hermetic, his book on Hermetic spirituality. That it's not necessarily dry philosophy or just intellectual cognitive exercise. It's actually about a form of participatory knowledge, right? And it's and then the knowledge is also there. You undergo an epistemic transformation, right? It's an epistemic transformation you go through in order to attain to that state eventually. And then you attain a certain form of knowledge that is state dependent. It's a form of knowledge that you would never acquire if you haven't gone through that process and experienced it firsthand, right? And so then when academics now study these texts and look back on it, if they themselves do not have the experience of what that means, that means they can never truly know what is being talked about, right? Because the knowledge
Mm-hmm.
that is described is actually state dependent.
State specific knowledge
Right.
as well is another term that Wouter uses. But I totally agree. I think that's a great point because it's almost like the the core of religion. If you just zoom out and think about what religion is, or as a whole, like it's just there's always been this urge to religion or religiousness in all humans, in all human cultures throughout history, generally speaking, I would say. And what is the Christian situation, the way that Christianity is organized, kind of lacks that centerpiece of the kind of the soul of religion, the main point of it, which is that initiatory or that direct experience relationship with the divine. I think that's kind of the core element of it. And now that was an aspect of Christianity, and that was what Jesus maybe was talking about in the beginning. And that's what the Christian mystics are all about. Christian mysticism also fits squarely into Western esotericism. But in terms of the church and what it's become, is kind of like an empty husk of a spiritual tradition where you're just left with the ideas and the dogma, which originally came from people that were reporting actual divine experiences or actual transcendent experiences.
Yeah.
And so now it's like it's missing its centerpiece, which I think if it had that, then a lot of people wouldn't, it's not even a concept in the West, I would say. The idea of an actual kind of enlightenment or a self-realization or transcendence or a unity with the monad or a transfiguration or whatever. It's not even a concept in the West, I would say. People in Christianity, like in the Christian framework, don't think that you can have this profound experience of divinity in the same level that Jesus was talking about, Whereas in other traditions, like in the East, with Buddhism and Hinduism, and with Western esotericism like Hermeticism and Neoplatonism, they express the explicit point of those traditions that people are saying in those works is that you should go and experience this just like I have. That's what we're doing here, and that's what's valuable.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Which is the exact opposite from what the church has been saying. It's more like, no, submit to our authority, but leave the experiencing to the clergy, and don't worry too much about that. Just worry about living a good life and not sinning, like basically follow the moral code, and then you'll be all right. But there's no incentive to speak spiritual self-actualization or something like that. The
right.
opposite, really, because that poses a threat
Yeah.
to the authority of the church, right? And then there might have
Yeah.
been mystics that are later then declared saints, but that's posthumously, right? After they no longer pose a threat to the authority, then the church can appropriate these people and say, like, yeah, they're now part of the canon, and they belong to they're extension of our authority now. But don't think that you can go out and be a saint yourself. Don't presume that much, right?
Yeah. Yeah, being a saint is not so much. They're still not explicit about what it is, you have Meister Eckhart, a Christian mystic, who was writing about union with the divine and oneness, and he was demonized by the church. He was seen as heretical because of talking, because he basically put himself on the level of God, and so that's a big problem in Christianity. So there's also this fundamental dualism in Christianity, which is also in materialism, where it's this dualistic nature between man or humans and the divine. Like God created the world separately, like a potter creating some pottery, and then he just put the world over there, and now he like put it into motion, and now there's this world happening over here. That's kind of the general view, is that God's a separate external being that just lives there. The man in the clouds myth, which is so ridiculous that people always ridicule and point to reasons why they're no longer Christian, but people then throw out all of spirituality or all of religion with the bathwater because they think it's just this one small particular theological idea, which I would also argue is a bastardization of the original teachings of Christ. Because, yeah, there's a lot of stuff you could go into there about Jesus saying things like the kingdom of heaven is within you. And yeah, I mean, that alone is pretty significant. And there's a whole nother, in the Nag Hammadi scriptures, you also have the secret text that they found where it's a lot more esoteric and a lot more mystical. And also in the Aramaic translations of Jesus, his original language, you find a lot more of a worldview that aligns with the non-dual worldview, where he is basically saying, me and the Father are one, saying like, I am one with the universe, one with the self, the eternal being. He's become merged with God. And he is actually actually teaching you how to do that. So it is just like every other spiritual tradition originally, but then it became bastardized by people in the church afterwards.
Yeah. I liked the way that I once heard Bernardo Kastrup explain this on an interview he did on Buddha at the Gas Pump, where he talks about basically the history of ideas. And he says that, the type of mythology that we used to live by within these religious traditions, they originate in a time when, these mythologies emerged from a place of true inspiration. And that true inspiration came from individuals that were actually living a connection with the divine, right? They were embodying that type of spiritual life that allowed them to experience divine inspiration and channel these ideas that then got translated into mythology, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that over time, as these mythologies became institutionalized, we basically we lost touch with the original source. And whereas, from where the mythology originated, there is still this umbilical cord to the one, right? An umbilical cord to, this transcendent dimension from which the mythology originated. That umbilical cord has been lost or severed. And then basically what happens is that, in this new iteration of the mythology, it starts to take on different shapes, and mythology is added on top of mythology. And it's no longer rooted in a true divine inspiration. And then it grows rampant, basically. And then it becomes dogmatic. And then there's mythology is no longer expressing some type of true eternal patterns, that have been divinely inspired, but it's just become arbitrarily imposed onto the world, and then no longer actually seems to correspond with the facts that we're discovering. So as the scientific revolution comes along and basically discovers facts that don't correspond with these arbitrary mythologies anymore, what we do is we discard the mythologies because we've, with our rational minds, come to find a better way to express the story of what the world is really like, right? Based on our observations. And in general, with that comes an improvement, because you leave behind superstitions and dogmatic beliefs that have become unfounded, basically. But of course, the scientific method is just intended to study the behavior of nature and basically expose certain patterns, predict the future based on the past, study the behavior of nature based on our empirical observation. But then what that does, of course, it cuts out the subject. It cuts out the experiencing subject. and the original mythologies came from a place of, you know, embodying a certain form of knowing, right? A certain epistemological perspective that gave us insight and wisdom that we cannot reach with the scientific methods. And so the problem with that is that we're still not tuning back into this umbilical cord from which the original mythology, was brought into the world. And then instead we rely on science to, provide us with a new worldview in this vacuum that has emerged, in which then what science starts to do is kind of basically overshoot its objective, and take a philosophical position that is not necessarily informed by the scientific discovery, but it's just an assumption about what the nature of reality is. So it's no longer about the behavior of reality, and then it becomes about the nature of reality, and then it becomes this philosophical position, an ontological position that tries to explain the nature of reality, and then basically creates a new dogma, right? And it doesn't actually fulfill the role that the original mythopoetic language fulfilled for us, which was expressing actually our own personal connection through this umbilical cord, with that transcendent dimension that's still severed, right? And yeah, I thought that was a brilliant, sort of exposition of the way that this history has unfolded, right? And why it's relevant also to reconsider these esoteric ideas, because they are exactly about, the personal, experiential dimension.
Right. And I would say they're also not necessarily esoteric. It's esoteric to who? Because if you were born in India, these kinds of ideas, the qualities of these ideas, would not be foreign or esoteric to you at all. The idea of Brahman and Atman, this fundamental being that emanates as people, and that you can go through this process of remembering your true self, is a completely commonplace idea in the East. And so these ideas, the point about it being an experience is a spiritual, personal experience thing that's available to people. This gnosis or this enlightenment experience is one thing, but I think a lot of there's that element, but then there's also the philosophical element, which is also something that people don't think about, because when people hear it framed like that, they often think it's illogical, or they think it's unrational, because they have this bias partly, but also because they think, well, there's this claim, there's this holy man, or there's stories of this fantasy stories of people having these divine experiences, or having out of body experiences, or stuff like that. But the thing is that it actually works on both fronts, because on an intellectual and logical level, when you read a guy like Bernardo Kastrup, his analytical philosophy basically demonstrates the worldview that we find in Western esoteric traditions. It demonstrates the worldview, which is a non-dual idealism, a world where there's non-duality, fundamental unity, as well as the fact that everything is consciousness ultimately, that somehow consciousness is primary. Or you could say, there's a lot of different ways of conceptualizing this, but you could say that ultimately there's this energy, or this being, or awareness, or consciousness, or mind, which is manifesting itself as the universe. And so these ideas, it makes sense on a logical level as well, even though it sounds like it doesn't when you first hear it coming from the materialist paradigm. But I think, how would you kind of explain how this works in like a logical, or in a way that's how, like, why do these ideas make sense fundamentally? How would you kind of explain that, I guess?
Yeah, that's a good question. It depends also what tradition you're talking about, because they also have, they also differ in their cosmology, the way that they view the cosmos.
Right.
And there's always some kind of idea of liberation that can be attained, I think, through a certain form of self realization, whether that is in alchemy or in Gnosticism or in Hermeticism. But there's definitely different differences also in the framework.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah, because I think there's different ways there's different stories that are told. You know, you have the idea of, you have the cosmology of it, where you have the idea of like emanation, or in Hinduism, this idea of like this oneness that then splits into two, and then splits into many many forms until we're here as separate beings experiencing this world. And that's one element of it. The other thing is that in a non-dual, in a kind of Advaita Vedanta way, with the non-duality, there's also this kind of localized, subjective, non-dual experience going on that can be pointed to and observed in meditation, which is the fact that it's difficult to point out, or it's actually impossible to pinpoint where your body ends and begins, or where the inside and the outside of your body begins, and where hearing thoughts, like hearing when you hear sounds, basically with all your five senses, there's actually no firm line between where they begin and where they end. And given that your subjectivity is the fundamental experience that you have, basically through this shift, through this almost gestalt shift, this like radical shift in perception, which is actually not so radical, it's just kind of pointing something out, which is not intuitive immediately, which is that the whole sensory experience that you're experiencing is basically one unified whole, right? It's a totality. It's a whole sensory experience. So it's like you're watching a movie, which has different parts on it, but ultimately there's this one screen, which that screen can be described as consciousness or the self. And ultimately there's like a literal non-duality in your direct experience, which can be pointed to in your phenomenology, in your subjectivity. Which I think when you start, for me, when I hear that kind of thing, then it grounds it in like, that's one element of how it becomes kind of more real and more tangible. And it's interesting because then you have the self. Yeah, I mean, you have the personal, like in the environment, non-dual experience where there's a fundamental unity between, there's a continuation between yourself and other, that can be pointed to, and there's lots of methods for this, like the headless way and stuff like that. So you have that non-duality between self and other in the environment, and then you also have this kind of cosmic, universal non-duality, where the whole universe as a whole is kind of like one mind or one being, which has then created the world, like manifested the world out of itself, which is interesting.
It's also like that there's something of a paradoxical worldview in there, right? Where there's, on an ontological level, like everything is one. There's the one being, the monad, the undivided, one with a capital O.
Yeah.
And yet we're here having this experience as if we're separate from the world. And this is sort of the gap between our experience and this idea, right? And then there's a process you can engage in to basically to cover the gap. And esoteric schools of thought basically address that question, address that problems. Like, how do you go from here, where what you're experiencing is the world of the many, and you have a feeling of being a subject, and you feel separate from the world, to the true and lasting insight that actually you are one with God, right? And there's no such thing as separation. The separation is actually an illusion. And then there's an epistemic shift where, everything that you are experiencing might be the same, yet your perspective is, radically changed. It's radically flipped, right? Where you suddenly realize that, like, even though you feel like you're experiencing the world as a subject, it's like that that duality is just an idea, really, and all that you're experiencing is actually just the totality of the experience itself. It's like the phenomenon is an undivided whole. And so in that phenomenon, that's what you are. You are the whole phenomenon. And then it can just click like that, and it can be the
which then
realization of
shifts you
that state.
out of the normal. Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to add something in there, which then shifts you out of the normal egoic consciousness that you're in, which is a big change, and it rids you
Right.
of the weight of your psychology and the normal anxious mind and the ego,
Right.
where you're this little man in your head doing stuff, because suddenly you're this like oceanic, just pure experience, pure being.
Yeah.
So it has a lot of positive benefits psychologically, I would say,
Yeah.
in that way. Well, yeah. I was gonna say, yeah, there's another thing. The other factor is that people have, with the psychedelic experiences that you see now doing these studies, these scientific studies. I would just put a bookmark in this point that people have these unitive experiences just as they're described in the mystical traditions of the West and the ancient East. With psychedelics and the current studies, and I wrote my thesis along these lines. My one thesis, which was that these experiences, these psychedelic experiences that they're studying now in labs, scientific studies in the last 10, 20 years have demonstrated that people consistently have these unitive experiences. These same experiences that the Hermeticists or the Neoplatonists are talking about. Very, very similar experiences. Basically, people report becoming one with everything. This complete transcendence, this divine beauty, this ego death, ego transcendence, it being an extremely meaningful experience. And so that kind of gives us more evidence that these things exist, or maybe points us to what's going on here. If you were a strict materialist, you could argue that they're just brain experiences that happen. But we do know that, the most cynical of the materialists, or skeptical, would say people are just making up stories. But now we know that argument doesn't fly anymore, because people like Christ and the Buddha and Krishna and Plotinus and Hermes were having experiences that we now know that we can induce in like Steve down the road if you just give him some DMT.
Which is a good point. I don't think people understand why that's relevant, but in academia, there's really been a climate of not taking these accounts seriously and actually explaining away these accounts, these historical accounts within religious studies, especially in the 90s. But you can still see the effects of this type of thinking in the current academic climate, where descriptions of mystical experience or descriptions of a religious experience that feature aspects like that divine oneness, or the idea of sort of getting a download of insight. There's a form of knowledge that can come to you through this type of direct unmediated experience, which is called the noetic quality, and different qualities that are traditionally attributed to this type of experience. There's like this more skeptical academics who fall under the school of sort of constructivism, would basically say like, well, whatever the description is of a supposed experience like that, that description itself is just a cultural historical artifact, and it's always going to be a product of its cultural environment. And the reason why people use certain terms to describe an experience like that is just because they have been conditioned to interpret the experience in that way, and the experience only gets its meaning once it's interpreted. And the interpretation is always just this cultural historical artifact, and so we can study that, but only as such. And there's nothing it's pointing towards, because there's no such thing as an unmediated experience. The meaning of the experience is mediated by our language, by our cultural conditioning, etc. And so when somebody would use the term like ineffable, it's ineffable. I just had an experience where it clicked for me. I had a profound revelation, and I realized the divine oneness of reality, and I experienced that directly. But I don't have the language to describe that because it's a shift in your perspective. It's an epistemic shift, an epistemic transformation. And it's like if you don't have a philosophical language at your disposal, it's like, how are you going to describe that? It's radically different from, what you have always known to be real. So language, which describes the real, the familiar, cannot be used to describe this thing that is so radically different, And so the best thing that you can do is say like, well, it's ineffable. I can't put it into words. And then the skeptic academics would say, they would see a word like ineffability. They would say like, the only reason why people say it's ineffable is so that they can flaunt with an exclusive authority based on their, exclusive experience, to which no critic or skeptic can make objections, because it's gotten this magical label of the ineffable. So it cannot be held under scrutiny by critics. And so basically what they're saying is like, it's a political power tool to call an experience ineffable, and then that type of experience is exploited for a certain type of religious political authority. And that's the way that they explain this type of language. And you can make that argument, you can do that, but you forgo this entire domain. You just close it off, you just reject it. It's another example of rejected knowledge. It's like, no, we're not going to take that seriously. We're not even going to consider that they're actually referring to something profound and significant. We're just going to interpret it according to our lens, by which we can reduce everything back down to power dynamics, etc. And that's the way that academics, still in the 90s, were looking at mystical experiences. That was the dominant school within religious studies, And so to learn about that was almost amazing to me. I was like, what? Really? This is, you would explain that away like that. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, and you're also just discounting the mountain range of evidence of people reporting these kinds of experiences, these kinds of mystical experiences, and it's a profound level of denial and bias that goes into that. I would argue that from reading the book The Flip by Jeffrey Kripal, he really explains how it's basically just sweeping it under the rug, and it's just turning a blind eye to it. Just a mountain of evidence of all kinds of things. Not only people having these profound oneness experiences, also people having experiences of telepathy or synchronicity, and these kinds of things that necessitate a worldview that's not materialistic. It necessitates a more open-ended worldview, a worldview that more aligns with a non-dual kind of consciousness-based worldview. People have these experiences all the time, and they have for thousands of years, and they have now in science laboratories when you give people psychedelics. So, yeah, and I mean, of course, the ego would say that with that kind of argument. It's the perfect thing. It's like, well, you say it's ineffable, so that's just your little thing to hide it, to obfuscate it, and to keep it like secret.
Yeah.
So therefore, I don't like it. Like, I don't like that mysterious nonsense mumbo jumbo that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And that also is kind of hits on the point of perennialism, right? Like, because it's a similar kind of argument to say that religions in themselves or religious experience are different. They're all different. Because there's the classic kind of spiritual view that you hear in spiritual traditions, where like all spiritual traditions or religions are talking about the same thing ultimately. And there's many routes up the mountain, but ultimately it's the same mountain. That's the one perspective. And then you have the kind of rationalist perspective, which is that they're all different. And this is actually the classic atheist argument that you see, like these Reddit atheists, these like Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins nerds talking about, like, will say things like, well, which god do you believe in, like Odin or Thor or Ganesh or whatever? Like, which god are you talking about? There's like 2,000 gods or something. Where they also say basically everything is fundamentally different, and it's all relative to the culture. It's all culturally relative. And so why does every religion have a different God, and why all these different things? So I don't know, how would you kind of address that? Or
Yeah, well, it's a good critique, even though it's kind of simplistic. Um, the idea that, like, well, if even if you're religious, you still don't believe in 99% of all gods. You just believe in your particular version of God or whatever. So you're basically an atheist for the most part, except for you make an exception for this one belief. Um, Yeah, I think it also presupposes that what religious mythology is sort of propositional truth, and that, you know, that's what you believe in. You believe in the religious mythology as an explanation of the world. And I think for me, I have a little bit of a different view of religious mythology. I think they're kind of like a coded map of metaphysics, of a metaphysical terrain. And I think there's different maps that you can use, and different maps afford different types of navigation, you could say, right? So with one kind of religious mythology, uh, you know, that might help you orient yourself in life in a particular way, and it informs you. I think that's what I also learned from reading John Vervaeke, is that what this religious mythology does is it informs the agent arena relationship. You know, it informs the way that, you know, what the world means for us, and it informs what we mean for the world. You know, and this relationship between the agent and the arena that it occupies, the meaning of that is informed by the ideas, you know, by the religious or mythology. Um, and there's all kinds of different iterations of that.
that's a
And
great point. Yeah.
Right. And then I think if you look at it as such, then it's no longer about what is, you know, descriptively true or what is a propositionally true. It's about how does it inform your perspective? How does it inform your mode of participating in reality? Right? How does it inform the process or the procedure that you engage in through life? And that to me is much more interesting. And against that kind of metric, there's a different type of value that different worldviews have. Um, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great point. But just to go back to the perennialism question, I think
Hmm.
the key thing that the critique that is there's all these different gods and all these different experiences, so they don't consider the possibility that all these different gods are just pointing to the same thing, are just a different
Hmm.
symbol that represents the same thing.
Yeah.
So like, are there like 2,000 gods, or is there just one god that every culture has their own version of? I mean, this is the thing. It's like we're talking about a religious experience, or the commonality between, say, Neoplatonism and Hinduism, where they both talk
Hmm.
about a oneness, a fundamental oneness that then emanates out into the world.
Yeah.
You know, the skeptic would say, well, there's the monad and then there's Brahman, and there's little differences in that. But I mean, ultimately, it's a very, very, very similar idea. Like, it's the most
Hmm.
uncharitable, ridiculously. It's almost laughable how how intellectually dishonest that is to say that the
Right.
monad and Brahman are not the same thing, or to say that, and it's basically like saying, Plotinus is not saying that the universe is fundamentally made of spaghetti, and the Hindus are saying that it's made of like lentils or something. It's like,
Hmm.
it's a very, very similar idea. It's like a oneness. It's a universal being. It's a cosmic intelligence that then manifests as people, and you
Yeah.
find that idea throughout all these cultures. And it's the
Yeah.
same idea that's very, very clear and very, very easy to find in the monotheistic religions as well, in the Abrahamic religions. So my position is that in that sense, yes, it is the case that all religions are talking about the same thing, but the same thing is a massive territory as well. So it's not
Hmm.
like all paths lead up to one mountain. It's like there's a mountain range of spiritual experiences and ways of looking at the world. They do share a fundamental commonality, but there's subtle differences. There's a multiplicity of things. There's multiplicity of experiences and views, but there is still a deep commonality that we find in all these traditions.
I completely agree. You know, and this was once also more common to theorize like this. You know, not that long ago, in kind of like the modern period, like the late 19th century and the early 20th century, scholars were also engaged in doing grander analyses like this and doing grander comparisons. Right, this comparative study of mythology or the comparative study of religion would lead to a kind of synthesizing meta narrative about, you know, what we can actually deduce from all these different mythologies, you know, these different worldviews and cosmologies from different corners of the world that haven't necessarily had contact with each other. And then we can see, if we study that analytically, then certain patterns emerge, and then we can see, like, yes, their formulations are different, and there's always going to be variations here and there. But if you look at it, you know, with some generosity, you can expose a fundamental underlying pattern that is being expressed through these different, you know, modes. Um, and that type of argument, you know, started to become more popular. And you know, there were great scholars who made arguments like that. But then with the postmodern turn, this type of project, this type of endeavor became critiqued because it was too generalizing, right? And it was too much, you know, kind of maybe also cherry picking certain things in order to construct this meta narrative. And so it went a little bit too far, perhaps. And so the counter reaction was to say, like, well, no, it doesn't leave enough room for difference, you know. And then the postmodernists took that again, you know, to the extreme where it's like, no, there's only difference, right? And so it's like a swing of the pendulum, right? And then it goes into the other extreme, and then basically negates any form of universality, and it only emphasizes difference. And still, you know, with us studying, you know, at the late 2010s, the early 2020s, this is still a dominant academic paradigm where it's like, no, you can't. It's now taboo to, you know, construct meta narratives. It's taboo to engage with phenomenology. You know, it's taboo to engage in a comparative study of religion or mythology. We only look at the difference. We look at the particular iterations of certain ideas in their particular historical cultural context, and we show how things are constructed as a product of their historical cultural context. Um, and and us, you know, studying in this context, you know, are just confronted with the fact that, well, we're overlooking this other reality, which is or at least, you know, we're no longer even taking the hypothesis seriously, you know, that maybe these experiences and their descriptions are pointing to a fundamental underlying reality. And yeah, people describe that in particular ways, and that's always informed by their context. But it doesn't mean that there is no underlying reality whatsoever. And you know, and that's still very interesting and worthwhile to look into. And then you can also go back to some of these, you know, modern scholars, yeah, again, look at
Yeah,
what the work that they were doing, the story that they were telling. And to me, actually, that's much more inspiring. It's a much more inspiring type of academic project. And sure, it had its faults and it was a product of its time. But now, with the knowledge of today, maybe we can look at that again and improve it instead of just, you know,
right.
trashing the whole thing, right?
Who would be some examples of those scholars?
Mircea Eliade, William James, Carl Jung, Joseph Campbell, Michael
Aldous Huxley,
Fraser,
right?
Aldous Huxley. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to
Yeah,
put
there's
that in
more.
there.
There's more, and there's also the more, you
Right.
know, not necessarily the scholars, but the more esoteric authors. You
Mm-hmm.
know, that
Like,
were
you know,
also
Rudolf
telling,
Steiner,
constructing grand narratives. Rudolf Steiner, Madame Blavatsky.
massive narratives.
Yeah,
That guy was
yeah,
spinning some huge narratives.
yeah.
Very interesting. Oh, and also
Or
Manly P. Hall was another
Manly P.
one.
Hall. Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
Yeah, epic.
yeah.
But the thing is that they sometimes do. I mean, with Manly P. Hall, like, it does sometimes border into the realm of like a little bit of
Conjecture.
fantasy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it becomes a little bit too much without this grounding of the skeptical academic side, which I think you
Right.
need.
That's
So
fair. That's
otherwise,
fair, of
it does
course.
go out of control. Yeah,
Yeah, you need both,
still
right? We need to
extremely.
strike a balance
Yeah,
between both.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I was thinking, well, yeah, Right, with the idea of the perennialism, this you're saying in the 1900s you have this idea that there's a commonality, common ground of being. It's also worth pointing out that in Western esotericism, in the tradition itself, there was a perennialism that's been very tied in with the tradition. You know, with
Mm-hmm.
it's in the 1900s with these academics, but actually, if you rewind and go back in intellectual tradition, it goes back to the beginning. You know, the ancient Greeks and the Egyptians and the Roman Platonists
Yeah.
that they believed that there was a fundamental truth, and that, you know, there was this kind of fundamental teaching, this kind of ancient wisdom which came from the past, which was even more profound and more pure and more holy, like, or, you know, the purest form of philosophy
Mm-hmm.
that was then slowly like lost over time. And you see this throughout, you know, throughout into the Renaissance and stuff, where there's the idea that from the past there's a more cohesive, older worldview. But whether there was some sort of ancient like great sages and like some ancient wisdom that is like timeless, perfect, or not, it still indicates a worldview that was shared by all these intellectuals and sages and mystics.
Mm-hmm.
That there was a commonality. You know, it's just not like today where everyone's like got their little tiny little niches that they're operating in, and everyone has their different worldviews. People agreed on these fundamental, on these universals, and especially with Egypt, it's interesting with the Hermetic tradition,
Mm-hmm.
where the texts that we find of Hermeticism are actually saying that Hermes Trismegistus, or Thoth, is a god or a sage that existed in the pre-ancient Egyptian civilization, and that the teachings of Hermes are thousands of years old. This is what they believed. They also believed that Hermes made the pyramids, which is another thing. But, you know, it goes back to also with the. It's totally makes sense with the Hindu civilization in the East, where you have some of the oldest texts ever written, the Sanskrit, the Vedas, and the Upanishads, being such profound, beautiful, non-dual, mystical philosophy and wisdom that completely mirrors the Western tradition. So it is almost the case that the oldest traditions share this fundamental worldview, which I would also
This.
add is
Mm.
the exact antithesis of the current worldview, which I think is a really
Mm.
interesting point, that it's a
Right.
non-dual consciousness first, non-dual mental consciousness ideal universe, as opposed to a dualistic physicalist
Mm-hmm.
materialist
Mm-hmm.
universe.
Yeah, and there's also a different understanding of the progression of knowledge, where the modern bias would be inclined to think that, like, well, the more into the future we go, the more advanced our knowledge and understanding is. And the more we come out of ignorance and into the enlightenment, right? With the
Mm.
increase of our knowledge, and at some point, science is going to give us all the answers, and whatever answers it can't give, it's just because it's still limited in its technology, but it's gonna get more sophisticated. Uh, but that's also a new idea, right? And an older idea is actually the idea that no, the farther back you go in the past, the more they knew, the more wise they
Mm.
were. And this is definitely also exemplified in the Renaissance, when some of these, antique traditions, esoteric currents, were first rediscovered. Maybe we can tell the story of Marsilio Ficino, right, and the
Hmm.
initial discovery of the Hermetic treatises. So, of course, in the Renaissance was occurring in Florence primarily in the 15th century, right, in the 1400s. It was really the center of flourishing of this passion for everything that had to do with antiquity. And the Medici family, of course, was the richest, most wealthy, most powerful family at the time in Florence. And the head of the Medici family was obsessed, like he wanted to know everything there was to know about the ancient world, and he was at the cutting edge, of course. And with all of his money, what he would do is we would hire scouts to send them out into the Levant, into like the sort of the world of antiquity, and basically go scout for Platonic treatises, for Greek texts, to bring them back and to translate them into Latin. Like the Medici, head of the Medici family didn't speak Greek, but then would have the treatises translated into Latin, and this is how the Platonic dialogues first made their entry back into Europe, in the 15th century, after having been lost for centuries. And so, so a lot of these Platonic dialogues were being brought back and being translated. And one of the people working on the translations was a young Marsilio Ficino, who's now famous. And he was playing an important role, right? Because he was one of the main translators of these treatises. And then at some point, the head of the Medici family was already an old man on his deathbed, right? But he's still hungry for this knowledge, for the latest insight. Why? Because he was living in a world that was devoid of the true spiritual depth, of the true wisdom traditions. And so they were so hungry and eager to bring this knowledge from the ancient world back, because there was bound to be a kernel of real transcendent truth, right? And something absolutely necessary to find self-realization in this life, to get to know the divine, through these works of philosophy. Then at some point, a scout brought back a text not by Plato, but by Hermes Trismegistus, the famed sage of ancient Egypt, And the idea was, well, Hermes, that's even older than Plato, right? So if Plato has the truth, then Hermes must definitely have the truth. He goes back to the ancient Egyptians, which were revered as, like a highly sophisticated spiritual culture. And so on his deathbed, he instructed Marsilio Ficino to translate Hermes first, So Hermes actually got priority over Plato, which now, considering the lack of attention towards the Hermetic philosophy or Hermetic spirituality, and the bias for Platonic philosophy in our culture, is a very striking story, that shows, first of all, the importance that, the Hermetic tradition had in the Renaissance, but also shows this idea of the prisca theologia, like the idea that the more ancient the theology, the more close to the truth it must have been. So yeah, I always like that story,
It's beautiful, brilliant. Yeah, very, very interesting. You also have the Nag Hammadi, which is a fascinating story as well, where they, I don't know, do you want to tell that story as well? About the Nag Hammadi?
Well, you know it. I can add in if you're forgetting something.
Well, it was also a major discovery for humans. It's basically in the 50s or so.
Yeah. Well, basically, the backdrop is that we didn't have access to the Hermetic treatises. We didn't really know the Hermetic writings or the Gnostic writings because most of them have been destroyed, right? So most of what we did know about them were actually from the critiques on these treatises that we still have. The sort of the against the heretics treatises, that were actually bashing the Gnostics or the Hermetic writings, mainly the Gnostic writings. And then it was in 1945, right? That some guy in Egypt, in some kind of family feud or something, and then for some reason he had to dig to hide something or whatever. I'm not sure, in the desert somewhere. And when he was digging, he encountered some stone pots, some clay pots, and then shattered them because first he was reluctant. This is the story, that he was reluctant to open them because he thought it might be a ghost, like it might be an evil spirit protecting the contents. But he also thought there might be gold in the clay pot. So then, his greed overcame his superstition and he shattered the pots. There wasn't gold. Well, there was sort of, like philosophical gold in them because in those clay pots were scrolls with the Hermetic treatises and the Gnostic treatises, which he then took home. And then the story goes, but it's also debated if that's true or not. It might just be sort of an Orientalist, urban legend, that his mom, used some of the scrolls as a fire starter, some of these ancient, rare, super rare ancient scrolls.
I hadn't heard that detail.
Yeah.
That would be crazy.
And then eventually it was a whole trajectory where they were at some point bought by some merchant or something. And then some officials got wind of it and it ended up in the Egyptian Museum or something. And then the Jungian Institute in Zurich at some point heard of it and acquired some of the texts. And only later were they translated and published in the 70s, I think. and that's now known as the Nag Hammadi Library, the Nag Hammadi Codices, because that's the name of the village where they were discovered, Nag Hammadi. And it's a huge library. It's a huge book collection of different books, codices, with Gnostic gospels, basically. So these are gospels from late antiquity, from the first 4 centuries after Christ, which essentially rest on the same legitimacy as the canonical gospels, with the only difference being that these specific gospels were rejected by the institutional church because they were deemed unfit to be part of the canon. And it's no surprise, because these gospels actually show quite a different version of Jesus. They show a version of Jesus, which didn't suit their agenda anyway, but it was a version of Jesus that was trying to, empower his followers to seek their own spiritual liberation and to follow Jesus' example, and not just his word. And it's also there are gospels where Mary Magdalene plays a more significant role as one of the followers of Jesus. There's different gospels of the apostles that never made it into the canon.
But what else was included along with the old gospels? Weren't there some Hermetic texts?
Yeah, Hermetic texts as well, right?
And Neoplatonic, right?
Right, sort of cosmological texts, laying out sort of the structure of the cosmos, how the cosmos came to be. So these cosmogenesis stories. Some pretty epic philosophy is in there.
So I mean, that is just the ultimate bombshell for the Western esotericists. I mean, these scholars must have been losing their minds when this happened, because to find something from, when was it from again? This how old were these texts
so
from?
Like the 4th century or something.
4th century. To find a group of texts that had contained secret gospels from the Bible that didn't make it into the Bible, as well as Hermetic texts from the Egyptian Hermes Trismegistus, and Neoplatonic texts, Platonic, based on Plato's teachings and the Neoplatonism in Rome, and to have it all together in one. I mean, it's incredible. Incredible finding. I just imagine some scholar just absolutely going crazy when this was discovered. Yeah.
Probably some monk buried it when he was being persecuted. Maybe their monastery was being burned down, and then he buried these scrolls that were then conserved for 1600 years.
And it shows the syncretism that was going on then, the cohesiveness with these worldviews, that someone was thought that all 3 of these traditions were valuable, that Christianity
right,
and Neoplatonism and Hermeticism were all great things to be learning about and thinking about, and great philosophical texts. And that also just shows how different the world used to be, or how we used to think differently 2,000 years ago in the West. And so I mean, I think that's beautiful. I think that's kind of the way that it rolls now. I think in terms of the meaning crisis, in terms of kind of solving the meaning crisis in the state that we're in today, like, that's kind of how it has to be as an individual, and maybe as society, I don't know, but at least as an individual, it kind of has to be that you are drawing from many different sources to inform your worldview. And that also includes the scientific paradigm, the scientific ways of thinking and insights from science and logical ways of thinking. And that's kind of essential. So, yeah.
You remember doing some readings on the Asclepius that was part of the Nag Hammadi library?
The Asclepius.
It's an
foolish
epic text
Asclepius.
to do. It's an epic text to do close reading of. Some of these texts are super enlightening. If you read them, it's like, wow.
Oh yeah.
It's fantastic.
It's incredible. Yep. I remember. The close reading of the Asclepius. Yeah, I mean, the description of meeting Hermes is so profound and so epic. I mean, it's almost it's almost like some supernatural science fiction type thing, but beyond that, it really rivals like a kind of an Arjuna and Krishna description of just meeting this being. Krishna emerges. I mean, Hermes emerges, and like the ground shake. There's something about there's like a static in the air or something, and it's this just massive presence that emerges.
Yeah.
It's an incredible story. And yeah, I mean, studying also the stories of Indian spirituality and hearing about the endless stories of gurus, this
Yeah.
kind of thing just fits in more when you've been acquainted with that. When you've heard about the countless stories, listening to the stories of a guy like Ramdas or
Yeah.
Gopi Krishna or whatever. I was just reading a new book by this guy called Om Swami. And when you hear these endless stories, it's the same thing as the synchronicities and the telepathy experiences and the near-death experiences and the psychedelics. You could just throw this in. There's guru encounters.
Yeah.
Where when there's so many experiences of this, so many reported experiences of ordinary people like Ramdas, who was formerly Richard Alpert, who's like the head of psychology at Harvard, goes and meets a guru and he determines, okay, this guy's not, this guy's legitimate because he just read my mind and opened my heart somehow with some look. You know, this is the head of psychology at Harvard. You know, this is not just some random guy who said this. And so, yeah, over the course of hearing about all of these kinds of things that go into this category of kind of unusual experiences, becomes clear that they're just real because it's very improbable that every single person, like every like 100,000 people that talk about this, are just lying or making it up or hallucinating.
Yeah. There's no
So
doubt about
that's what
it.
people, yeah, it's what people don't. People aren't aware of that this exists to that degree.
Yeah.
And it changes the whole picture. It's actually illogical. It's actually irrational to not
Yeah.
take that view. So the people that
Right.
think they're being hard-nosed rationalists are actually ignorant. And if they were presented with this and they denied it, they would just be being extremely irrational to a preposterous degree.
Yeah, that's right. So funny, eh? That people are so raised to be skeptical about everything that is has to do with spirituality or the supernatural or something. But the same skepticism, they don't apply the same skepticism to their own, bias. And they're not skeptical of science overshooting its object by postulating an ontology for which it has no evidence, right? And then people adopt that uncritically, basically, and then from that position exclude certain pieces of evidence, which actually, from a scientific perspective, should be taken into consideration, right? And there's so much evidence now to suggest that some of our assumptions about the nature of reality are incorrect, and actually some of this stories about the nature of reality that we take from spiritual traditions correspond better to the facts. Then why aren't we correcting our presuppositions? Isn't that what we're supposed to do if we're scientifically minded?
Exactly. On that note, I would ask, do you think one of the questions that we posed was, you could answer this in any way, but do you think that the ancient wisdom of the West and Western esotericism, the rejected knowledge, do you think that we can find ways to solve the meaning crisis in these traditions?
Hmm.
Is this the answer? Should we look back to the past and restore our ancient glory of philosophical greatness? Go
Well,
back to
I
the
think
past and
if
bring
we
it
talk
back.
about, I think what we need is we need ways of navigating inner change, ways of navigating psychological transformation. And I mean psychological in the broadest sense of the term, right? Because psyche originally means the soul. So psychological transformation is like a transformation of the soul or transformation of consciousness. And what I think is that there are certain forms of transformation of consciousness that are inaccessible. It's like we live with certain inhibitions, right? There are certain doors in our mind that are closed. And to the point where we now assume that they can never be opened. We don't consider that they could be opened. But actually, I believe that there are doors in our minds which have been closed for very long, but which might very well be opened. But the way to open them is not, you can't just arbitrarily decide to open the door. Some doors in our minds can only be opened through engaging in certain psychotechnologies, what you can call psychotechnologies, or like rituals are an example of that, for instance, or certain initiatory
Or
processes.
meditation,
Exactly. Meditation, yoga, and then
etc.,
not just
etc. The list
not
goes
just the
on.
postures, but yeah.
Yeah.
And I think in Western esotericism, in the history of Western esotericism, if you think about alchemy, the language of alchemy, but also the cosmologies from Neoplatonism and Hermeticism, and the stories that we get from the Gnostic tradition, I think they're so rich in symbol. They're so rich in the mythopoetic language that if you're inclined towards that, if that's something you resonate with, that they can be a tremendous source of inspiration. And reading them as an academic, to study them as a part of their socio-historical context is one thing. But reading these sources, as a spiritual aspirant is another thing altogether, And then if you take, you have to strike the right balance between taking certain liberties in following your intuition about what these texts are really talking about, because often they're very, especially when it comes to alchemy, for instance, or the Rosicrucian manifestos or something like that, they're very cryptic, extremely cryptic. And you kind of have to know the right hermeneutic to study these texts and understand these texts. And you have to be skeptical, and it's good to keep in mind that these things are a product of their context, and they might sometimes not completely reflect something that is relatable to you, because we're a product of a different time. But I still think you could find in them kernels of truth, of a guiding insight, and pieces of wisdom that can mean a lot, and that can really help, effectuate this type of transformation that we were talking about.
Mm-hmm. Great answer. I would think to the question, do these traditions solve the meaning crisis, or could they? I would say yes, they do. The fundamental ideas contained in the history of Western spirituality do contain a truth. I would say, like you say, there's truth to these ideas. But that doesn't mean that we should go and start becoming Neoplatonists and try and like spread the word of Neoplatonism to convert everyone to the Church of Plotinus or something, or Hermes, as awesome as that might be. But it's just an indication. It's just part of our broader kind of intellectual, spiritual endeavor is to understand that there was deep truth in the spirit in the West, and that we can learn from that and see how it also informs us today, and we might create completely new worldviews and new spiritual technologies and spiritual traditions or spiritual ideas that also align with science and align with things like quantum physics, the quantum field theory, the observer effect, the studies that they do now about telepathy that reveal a different kind of worldview than we thought.
Yeah.
We can just see that these ideas have a history, and they have a pretext and a foreground and a prologue to where we are now.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also been a lot of debate and philosophical discussion, like in Plato talks about the world as an illusion that needs to be transcended. And there's kind of this dual aspect monism going on, whereas Plotinus is talking about the entire world as just the divine, as the absolute ground, as the absolute quantum field.
Mm-hmm.
So there's different perspectives on it, and there's different takes that you can have philosophically and as an individual and as a collective that have a meaningful implications for how you view the world and how you view yourself and how you view others and how you navigate the arena of life as well. So yeah, there's a lot of wisdom in it. It's a rich garden of meaning. It's a rich tapestry of beautiful ideas that are there to be enjoyed by people, I would say, mainly. And we can harvest some of the wisdom. And yeah. But fundamentally, I would say there's deep truth that we lack today. We actually lack the truth on a fundamental level, on an absolute level, that the ancient Egyptians and ancient Greeks and ancient Romans had. Even though we have certain truth that they don't have, certain propositional knowledge.
Here's a little note by John Vervaeke on the meaning of gnosis, which we talked about earlier. really what the project of Gnosis is all about is a set of psychotechnologies that create a ritual context. And the ritual context shakes us free from existential entrapment, because that's where we are, right? In our ordinary state of living, we're in existential entrapment. And the psychotechnologies that create a ritual context, are meant to shake us free from that existential entrapments. And then he says these psychotechnologies can help generate those higher states of consciousness discussed in early chapters. Like that's where it leads to, right? The higher states of consciousness. Sometimes augmented by shamanic disruptions or psychedelic aids that transform our ways of knowing and give us a taste of a greater reality, a new vision of life itself. Right? That's what it ends up doing. It it gives you a deeper insight into the nature of reality. It reveals certain things to you that are otherwise hidden. Right? And I think much of the history of esoteric, Western esotericism in general has been about the technologies that can actually allow you to see that for yourself, to have that type of vision, to have that type of experience, that form of knowing where subject and object are transcended, and you can experience the divine unity in your own mind, which then is one with the mind of God. And that's sort of a return to the one, after a fall from the one or an emanation from the one into the world of the many. So there's also a cosmological narrative that you can complete. It's like a cycle you complete with a return to the one. And yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
what's there not to like about that?
Yeah, exactly. It also gives you, even if you don't have this non-dual experience, necessarily, it gives you a more beautiful world to live in, a more beautiful vision of the world. And it grounds so many important ideas, like Plato's ideas of the forms of the good, the true, and the beautiful as concepts that exist, that you can ground your life in and orientate yourself around. And understanding that truth exists and truth is valuable for very profound reasons, and love exists and beauty exists, and these are existential ontological things. It's completely alien to our current worldview, but it's not alien to Plato, and it's not alien to a lot of people, and it makes a lot of sense. And so it gives a more inspiring vision of the universe and the self, where death is transcended as well, and all things are kind of made whole with this fundamental unity and divinity. Right. And there's ways of understanding evil, and there's ways of understanding human beings as context in the universe and our place in the world, and what we're here for, and where we came from, and where we're going. And it just makes life more beautiful, I would say. It allows you to savor like moments more and enjoy the present moment more and see more beauty when you look at a tree, I would say. And I mean, also, that's not even to speak about the journey that's going on, the journey of self-actualization or transcendence that's going on, the psychological growth that's basically tied in with these traditions, where there's a process of purification and clearing away of your kind of lower natures, your biases, your corruptions, so that you become a more perfect being, basically, over the course of one life or many lives. And so the growth that one gets from that is massive. And it's not in the context, in our current society, there's the psychology paradigm, which primarily treats people when they have a problem or a neurosis, and then they treat them psychologically to get them back to like a normal baseline level. But that's not what we're talking about here with these spiritual traditions. We're talking about you're already at the baseline. You need to get yourself to the baseline. And then we're talking about elevating yourself beyond that to superhuman levels, to becoming like, like a Ubermensch, like Nietzsche speaks about. So it's not about psychological growth to like deal with your complexes or whatever. Just, that's part of it. But there's a greater growth, which is beyond the baseline, normal, healthy human, towards orientation that leads you to the divine. So it's a totally different paradigm. And there's so much meaning that comes from that. And there's such an epic kind of epic ethos that comes with that. Like you're some sort of ninja warrior, some sort of epic cosmic warrior, like, performing these sadhanas, these spiritual practices. And you're on this journey towards some sort of infinite ideal, which just makes your life, gives it this epic mythic quality, which I certainly really enjoy, that element of it.
Absolutely.
And I think a lot of people would be missing out on that, or are missing out on that, partly because they're so distracted by what's immediately in front of them in terms of social media and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you would like to add? I think maybe we can wrap it up now in a bit.
Yeah. No, I think it's a good point to wrap it up. There's still other things to get into. Like we didn't really talk about astrology, for instance, which is also very much a part of the Western esoteric tradition.
That's true. I would like to do an episode on astrology as well.
Yeah. And we can definitely do a standalone episode on the history of alchemy and the meaning of alchemy, and also the Jungian interpretation of alchemy. So basically, we just scratched the surface a little bit of the history of Western esotericism. And the fact is, like, even if you do a 2-year master's, at the University of Amsterdam, specializing in the history of Western esotericism, which is a great thing to do, you still only scratch the surface, right?
Yeah. No doubt about it.
You start to familiarize yourself a little bit with the terrain, but you haven't really explored anything properly, so it would be great if we can continue some of that in the podcast.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks for tuning in to our listeners. Make sure to like and subscribe. Join us along for the journey, the great adventure into the heart of meaning. And gonna be good.
See y'all next time.